So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Welcome to this webinar in the series around Professor Gilbert's book called Borrelia burgdorferi by Springer Protocols, called Methods and Protocols. And we're delighted to have the authors of chapters 13 and 14 with us today. That's Professor Stephen Croucher and Dr. Theo Susnjak, and they will be introducing themselves in a moment. Of course, you'll all know Professor Gilbert, who's also here and will be hosting. And the topic of our talk today is Decoding Lyme disease, how AI is shaping our understanding of tick-borne illnesses. So the presenters will talk for maybe about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. So please do put them in the chat or the Q&A. And we very, very much look forward to all of you. Thank you so much. It's very, very early where they come from right now. It's New Zealand is where Dr. Susnjak comes from. So it's just 8 o'clock there, isn't it, Dr. Susnjak, in the morning. So we're very, very, I'm not sure, Professor Croucher, where Massey University is. Can you just remind me? Because I know you were
in New Zealand as
Oklahoma.
well.
Sorry?
In New Zealand.
Oh, you're from New Zealand as well. So for both of them, it's extremely early. So we're so grateful to you for being with us. And of course, Professor Gilbert from Finland, it's extremely late. So a particularly warm welcome to you and a big thank you. So I'll sign off now and over to you. Thank you.
Cheers. Yes, I want to thank you while I share my screen here. Thank you for attending this session. And as Jillian said, that we are really honored to have our colleagues here with us from New Zealand. And I would like to have Professor Croucher, Stephen, if you could, give a little introduction, and then Theo, if you can as well. So if you please start.
Kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou, kia ora koutou. So, morena, good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Croucher. I am a professor of communication and analytics, and I am the head of school for communication, journalism, and marketing at Massey University based in Wellington, New Zealand. So I'll leave it there so we have more time to talk about important things. So, good morning.
Hello, so my name is Theo Susnjak. I'm part of the School of Mathematical Computational Sciences. I'm a computer scientist by background, and I work mostly in machine learning.
Great. Okay, I'm going to share screen again and share the presentation. So I know I say this every time we have this roundtable that our passion to do this book was really to get a cross-disciplinary kind of compilation of actually techniques to really investigate, the intricacies of, Borrelia burgdorferi that causes Lyme disease. And doing so and trying to get this cross-disciplinary kind of partnership, of course, we wanted to, have kind of unique techniques that anybody could actually pick up the book and, follow the protocols. And one of them was these 2 chapters, because I think more and more we need to be very specific and very cautious about the narrative that's surrounding tick-borne diseases, as chapter 13 has. It's really investigating the content analysis of how we depict tick-borne diseases in media. And then, of course, chapter 14 in applying this machine learning, tools like BERT and ChatGPT to analyze the sedimentation that's occurring, surrounding Lyme disease in scientific literature. Because I think that we need to do better with the narrative, and I was really honored to have, Stephen and Theo to do these two chapters with us for this book. And this presentation basically is starting off with an overview of tick-borne diseases, and I'm sure you guys know this quite well, but I just wanted to recap just in case there are people in the audience that doesn't know why we are concentrating on tick-borne diseases here. And also the purpose of the presentation is really to explore how media and scientific literature can depict the diseases and how they depict it differently, and understanding the influences of these depictions on public perception, healthcare decisions, and policymaking. And why it matters, because as I mentioned, misinformation or biased portrayals of tick-borne diseases, especially like in the field of chronic Lyme disease, can lead to, okay, misdiagnosis or inappropriate treatments. And just basically that, patients are being turned away. So I think we have a lot to do to change the narrative and help the patients more. And really the passion is this. We speculated, I think maybe 6 years ago, that by 2050, okay, based on literature, peer-reviewed publications, that 2.8 billion people will be infected with a tick-borne disease. And actually in 2022, Dong et al. Actually published a study, a global study that surveyed the serology of people all across the globe against Borrelia antibodies. And they indicated that we're already reaching 1.2 billion infected people or people that have seen Borrelia before. So we're actually reaching our target. And this is sad because we need to do better. We need to help these patients because as reported, okay, we have 2 million people that are suffering from considered long-hauled or chronic Lyme disease patients, okay? And again, the narrative is interesting. In our slides, we say long haulers, but they are really chronic Lyme disease patients that has been published actually recently. So, and this number is just growing and growing and growing. And this is where we have to curve these numbers. And I think we can curve them by using this, the same narrative, the accurate narrative, and doing more research for the patients. So this is why it drove us to do this book. And this is why we're going to do this book again. And so now at this point, for the topic in hand, I will give the slides over to Stephen and Theo.
Thank you, Leona. So I will just say when Leona first approached me about this, this was probably about 7, 10, 11 years ago, 11 or 12 years ago when I was working in Finland. And she was looking for different ways to study tick-borne diseases. And one of the things that came up was my background is more in media studies and in statistical analysis, so the two areas coming together. And I was looking at, well, how can we study these, how can we study this from, how media is depicting it? How can we study and look at how, Lyme disease, tick-borne disease? I had no idea what it was at first, what it was called, how we call it. I had no idea about the vernacular, the language. So I came in very much as a new person into this. And so I was interested kind of in really, what patterns people call this area of research, this area really. And so that's for me, the first thing was content analysis. And so content analysis is as it says here, a systematic research method that analyzes content of text to identify patterns and themes. And one of the things that's important to point out here is that a text is pretty much almost anything. So I have students who are looking at Instagram posts. So they're looking at the pictures. People can look at a Twitter feed. They can look at an advertisement. They can look at one word. They can look at a statement made by a vice presidential candidate during a debate. They can look at almost anything can be a text. And so that's the interesting thing about it. One of the things that we've looked at, and we're starting to look at now, so I'll talk a little bit more later, is we're looking at how do news articles talk about tick-borne diseases. So we're looking at the title of the article and what's talked about in the article. So there's two types of text, which help us understand how do laymen or the average person understand tick-borne diseases. And so just a little bit to understand when it comes to text. And content analysis has been used systematically since probably the 1700s. When you go back to Sweden, it was used to look at actually hymnals, books, to look at how is God depicted in hymnals. So they've used it in so many different areas. And when it comes to how we apply it to tick-borne diseases, it's been applied to media sources to understand public sentiment. And so that's when we've looked at, say, newspapers, magazines, television, to look at basically what messages have been put online in newspapers, because the messages that are out there impact how people understand that content. It's like if you say, the sky is red, the sky is red, the sky is red, the sky is red. You keep saying that enough. Some people are going to believe it. And so that's where we're looking at these sources to see how it impacts public sentiment and biases. And so that's the importance of it, is it uncovers how diseases like Lyme disease are represented and the impact on public perception. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Leona.
Yes.
Yeah, great. And so when it comes to the media platforms, there's quite a few that can be really analyzed here, and I think that are important for us to consider when it comes to looking at not only content analysis in general, but also particularly looking at Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. Is platforms such as X, which used to be called Twitter, Facebook, news outlets, forums, particularly forums by advocacy groups and other groups, and looking at really the communication around and how Lyme is framed and how Lyme is depicted, how tick-borne diseases are depicted, how testing is depicted, and so on and so forth. Because it tells us really the narrative. It tells us what people are saying, what people are thinking, and it helps, I would say, helps shape the debate, which is important. Some common themes that have been already identified and some common themes that we're starting to identify even further, because I've got a couple of our master students in our Master of Analytics program who are starting to look at this. And it's getting, I will say later, it's getting harder and harder to look at this because more and more of these media platforms, particularly X, are making it harder and harder to actually do data analysis because they want you to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for it. But more and more of my students are starting to look at this. And some of the themes that they've already identified are things like sensationalism. The idea that, what I mean by that is there's been some examples where some media outlets have said, Lyme disease has taken over the world. Very few have said that, but a few have actually said that. Or the exact opposite of that, that there is no such thing. And so you see the two extremes of that. And so it's basically that bipolarism when it comes to the significance of tick-borne diseases. So you'll see that not only in news outlets, but also in the scientific journals. You see that extremism. You'll also see misinformation. You see quite a bit of that. We saw that during COVID-19. I've done a lot of research on COVID-19 and vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy. You saw a lot of news articles talking about, the issue of you can use bleach, particularly after Donald Trump talked about bleach and other things you could use to fight off COVID. A lot of news articles and news outlets took that up and spread that narrative. When certain people, unfortunately died from certain vaccines and other things from other health conditions they had, this was picked up by certain outlets, particularly outlets of certain political motives. This misinformation spread. And so you'll see a lot of this misinformation also when it comes to tick-borne disease. Celebrity, this is one of the things you'll see as well. If a celebrity is diagnosed with an illness, it's picked up. And more that narrative is spread. This is now a significant illness because X celebrity has it. Like I believe Avril Lavigne is one who years ago, there was more articles about Avril Lavigne when she came out about her plight and her struggle. So there were a lot more articles about it because news outlets feel like people will care about it because Avril has it. But otherwise people won't care, is what the news outlets think. And then there's the emotional appeal. And we see the idea of emotional appeal all the time, whether it's in debates between politicians, which originally I'm not from New Zealand, I'm from the United States. So last night I was watching the vice presidential debates in the US, and this is one of the things that Governor Tim Walz talked about extensively was when he was talking about the abortion debate in the US. He talked about 3 women. This was not, by accident. This was an emotional appeal. And this is something that happens in all medical types of debates. People will talk about this person has this issue. And if they put a face on the issue, people care about the issue more. And so you'll see this quite a bit in news outlets. And so what you can do in content analysis is you can actually look at how often is that done. Not only how often is it done, but you can then take that a next step and you can really see what has been the effect of that, which is kind of cool, actually, if you think about it. I'm a researcher, so I actually think research can be cool. So that's just how I am, a kind of nerd that way. And then you can see the impact is media does skew our understanding. A lot of people think, well, I'm not impacted by media. Media doesn't, impact what I think about, but it does. There's so much research showing whether you're looking at, I can go into the theoretical understanding, but it's black and white, that what media says overwhelmingly does impact how we look at X, how we look at something, is if media does tell us enough that the sky is red, if they keep telling us that, eventually people are going to agree with that and believe it. And so it does skew our understanding. It does lead to misconceptions or truthful conceptions. And it does amplify or minimize fear. But what we're seeing here is that more and more we're actually seeing that in some cases, misunderstanding is being increased, misconceptions are being increased, and fear is unfortunately being amplified, particularly when it comes to tick-borne disease and Lyme disease. Next slide, please.
Yes.
So how do we do this? Well, there's the easy way to do this, and we talk about it in the chapter, so which is great. But you have to gather your text. You have to decide, what text am I going to use? And I've done different types of texts in the past. So I think probably 15 years ago, for example, I did an analysis of how the French government was trying to fight AIDS by showing superheroes dying of the AIDS virus. And so they had, pictures of Wonder Woman and Batman and Superman in the hospital on IVs, looking very, very ill and basically on their deathbed. So I used those images. So it could just be an image and multiple images. So you have to choose your text carefully and justify your text. So you have to gather those texts. So say we're focusing on social media. We're looking at how tick-borne disease is being discussed on Facebook. So we've chosen Facebook, and we can justify why Facebook, because it has images and text. So it has two different forms or two different channels of communication. So we've chosen that. So that's our text. So we're going to look at that. We then need to categorize them. So, but what we're doing here is we're looking at pretty much, we're developing themes in this case. So there's two different ways we can do this. So a new study we're doing right now is I have a student and we're working together. We're looking at 4 different news outlets. We're looking at CNN in the US. We're looking at the CBC in Canada. We're looking at the ABC in Australia and Radio New Zealand's website here in New Zealand. So 4 English-based news outlets that have online presence. And we're looking at, so that's our text. And we're looking at how do they categorize, how do they frame tick-borne disease and Lyme disease? And we're looking at over the past 15 years on their website. So that's our data set. We've collected all the data. And so what we're doing is, the first way we could categorize the data is by looking at everything and saying, okay, what's emerged? So what are the common themes? What are the common ideas? So we have to basically read everything and see, well, we're finding these 5 articles all share the same thing in common. So we have to go from the ground up and develop our ideas, develop our themes from the ground up. That's the first way you can do it. So these 5 articles all clump together on celebrity. These 5 talk about deer, is plural for deers, deer. These 5 talk about testing. So we have to create our themes. We have to give them names. In the end, we'll have too many themes, and we have to narrow them down. Or you could go in with predetermined themes. So you could say, I'm going to look at all of these articles with these 4 ideas in mind. And you would do that based on research. I know that Leona and I, and a master's student, published a piece, I believe, I'm dating myself now, I'm feeling old, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, where we used content analysis and we created themes. So you could use the themes we used and see if our themes work on your data. So it's like basically using a testing regiment's already there and seeing if those results apply to your data. So you can do one or the other, bottom up or top down. And then you analyze it. There's 2 ways to analyze it. You can either do a very quantitative approach. So how many times in these 4 news outlets, CNN, CBC, ABC, RNZ, how many times do they talk about tick-borne disease and Lyme disease? It's basic number. What's the statistical difference between the 4 of them? It's a stat. It's actually a chi-square. And then you can look at, okay, so when we look to the frames, is which frame is, which theme is most prevalent. It's just basic numbers, is what you do. It's very descriptive, which is actually very interesting in many ways. Or you can go from there and talk about qualitative, where you say, let's talk about these themes, let's break them down and really discuss them. And I've talked about some example studies that we've already done. So that's the basic process of it. And let's talk more about it in the chapter. So as I've said, to summarize some of that, most of the research that we're doing and most of the things we're finding show that media often portrays Lyme disease as severe and an urgent health crisis. It doesn't really talk about Lyme being long-term. It talks more about being an urgent, health crisis now for people. There's a high prevalence of negative sentiment and fear-mongering, where this is something you need to be very careful of about going in the woods, particularly the stuff we're finding in the US and Canada. Talks a bit about that. Examples of narrative: Lyme is newsworthy when a celebrity has it. That's the big thing. It's more newsworthy, particularly in, I would say it is more in the US and Canada even. It's more newsworthy when celebrities have it. There's more of a discussion of deer and Lyme than anything else, and limited coverage outside of the US and Canada in English-speaking media. There's very little of it in Canada and in Australian and New Zealand media. Very little coverage. Thank you.
So
Okay, Taylor?
I
Yeah.
came into this project about 5 years ago, where the problem that was posed to us was, can we apply some sort of sentiment analysis on academic literature? And so sentiment analysis, well, first of all, well, what is it? And essentially, as you can see on the slides, it's an algorithm, it's a computational process that tries to extract motive tones out of pieces of text. And back in the day, what we used to do was we used to train or create custom-made machine learning models that would do this. And that was quite a process. You would have to collect examples of positive sentiment text and examples of negative sentiment text, and then train your model to essentially discriminate between the two. But what we have now are models that are very, very difficult to beat. They're very accurate and very reliable. And so in the chapter, if you have a look at it, the two approaches, the two models that I tried to show how they work, one is called BERT, which is essentially a very capable language model. And you'll know what ChatGPT is. It is a large language model. It's a much larger version of BERT. And what I showed in the chapter was how those two can actually be combined together in order to perform relatively accurate analysis of sentiment on any given topic of text. So why were we doing this? Well, when I came into this project, I knew something very little about Lyme disease. I had heard of it. We don't have it in New Zealand, so I didn't know a whole lot. But I certainly didn't understand that there was a massive controversy around this topic. And I didn't know that there was a controversy around chronic Lyme disease and whether or not that is caused by an ongoing infection of Lyme, or whether or not it's associated with some sort of a post-treatment effect or some other factors. So this was the controversy that we were trying to see, well, where does the sentiment lie on academic literature, and particularly on the abstracts? If you could go to the next slide, please. So what we did was we collected about 5,500 academic abstracts, all that met the search criteria of Lyme and Lyme disease. And we collected the abstracts ranging from 2010 to 2021. Actually, that's a mistake. It was from year 2000 to 21. So about 20 years worth of abstracts. The results that I'm going to show you are somewhat updated. And so what I'm going to show you is our filtering of those 5,600 abstracts to the abstracts that are only talking about the post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, the PTLDS, the chronic Lyme disease, and show you some relevance that are very, very specific to abstracts and academic articles that are talking about this topic. And so what we're looking to see is, can we detect any sentiment in those papers that discuss this topic? And subsequent to that, are we able to extract viewpoints? Is there a stance that we can detect in an abstract that the authors are taking on this controversial topic of chronic Lyme disease? Now, this is a challenging problem because for anybody that's read scientific papers, they don't have usually emotive cues. They tend to be very dry, very objective. And so it's quite difficult to extract sentiment from them. But it is possible actually now, more than ever before, given the AI capabilities, to actually extract stance, to do what we call stance detection or viewpoint detection. We could go to the next slide, please. All right, so in the chapter, I talk about the steps. What do you need to do in order to collect the data, how to clean it? As I mentioned before, I show some code in the chapter on how to use this model called BERT and some of the prompts in terms of how you can use and leverage large language models like ChatGPT, but others as well in terms of verifying the results. Often you want to verify and validate that what one model is saying is consistent with what another in a completely different model is saying. Now, the third thing that is important, and this is a hot topic of machine learning, but also in other areas, because we're all starting to use machine learning a lot more, is can we understand the mechanics of the machine learning models in terms of how are they classifying and how are they coming up to their conclusions about the things that they're trying to detect, identify, categorize. So there I talk about using what we call SHAP. These are shapely tools. They use game theory under the hood in order to try and unpack and open the hood underneath these black box models, which come up with classifications that are mystifying. We can't understand them. So I show you how we can actually take a piece of text and we can run it through these really powerful tools like SHAP, and they will color code particular words in your text that will kind of alert the model to a negative or a positive sentiment, which will then be aggregated in order to come up with a final classification. And so these are wonderful, wonderful tools that will give you the ability to sanity check your models to see, is the model actually reacting well to the data that I'm providing it? Okay, now in terms of the outputs that sentiment detection models usually produce, it's a polarity score. It usually ranges from -1 for negative sentiment to +1 and anything in between. But that is not the only output it can produce. So in this slide, I've got other models that have been used for quite a few years that are able to do a more sort of nuanced classification of text and pull out other emotions such as joy, fear, anger, and disgust, which could be relevant to the particular domain that you are applying things for. So if we could go to the next slide. And if you could click it again, so we have a graph that comes up. Right, so this is now the result of us filtering the 5,600 abstracts into ones that are just relevant and seem to be talking about the chronic Lyme disease. So this shows you how many papers since 2000 through to 2021 have been identified, and this is a little bit early. This is subject to a little bit of revision, but this is currently what we have in terms of papers that seem to be specifically talking about chronic Lyme disease and post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. Now, if you go into the next slide, this gives you an aggregate view where we have applied very sophisticated large language models, actually the most cutting edge ones, to actually identify markers within the abstract that seem to indicate the stance of the authors on this issue of chronic Lyme disease. And so what we're seeing is that it's fairly evenly spread in terms of who supports chronic Lyme disease as a real thing, who refutes it, and who takes a more of a neutral and balanced position on it. We see that more recent literature seems to be tilting more towards supporting the idea and the notion that there is such a thing as chronic Lyme disease, and it is mostly associated with an ongoing infection. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. And if you could click it twice for the graph comes. Right. So what we did here was I applied a smoothing rolling average across all of the years from 2000 to 21. And what I was looking at is, okay, let's have a look at the percentage of studies that support chronic Lyme disease, and let's subtract the percentage of studies that refute it. And let's see how the conversation has changed over time, looking at whether or not majority of the studies seem to support or refute the position. And so the black line there supports 0. Anything above shows that there's a majority of studies supporting chronic Lyme disease, and beneath that you can see that they're refuting it. So over time, and this is smooth, we can see that the conversation has kind of oscillated a little bit, but there is a trend. So from about, let's say, 2011-12, we seem to, there is some indication that there's a shift in the conversation. And so what we're hoping to look at now is, are there some seminal studies that have perhaps emerged in those years where there has been an inflection point that have kind of tilted the conversation towards one side of the argument or the other? And if we click that slide again, the final graph is going to come up. And the other question that we had posed was, are there particular journals and outlets that tend to favor a certain position on chronic Lyme disease? And so what you see in this final graph is the top 10 publications in terms of their volume of output on this topic of chronic Lyme disease, where, again, what we have done was subjected the percentage of studies that they have published that support and refute chronic Lyme disease. And that shows you where the tilt is. Now, this is not to say that there is a definite bias within these publications. It could simply mean that, well, maybe the reviewers that they use, the pool of reviewers on this topic have a particular stance. It could mean that academics that have a particular position seem to favor a certain outlet as well. So we're not attributing any bias, but it seems to show that there is some favoring of a certain stance and position among certain outlets more so than others. So if we go into the final slide for me. So essentially, we are able to show in our data that this topic has a lot of division within academic literature, but it's not that clear cut. And so the subsequent analysis that I've kind of been looking at is, even though the controversy is real around chronic Lyme disease, there are points of conversion. So what we're seeing is the majority of the studies do actually come together. They agree that there are patients who have ongoing issues, symptoms, and difficulties after treatment. So everybody's unified on this, mostly. However, the issue is, what is causing these symptoms? Is it an ongoing infection, or are there other factors that are playing a role? The other point of convergence amongst all of the studies, whether they support or refute chronic Lyme disease, is that the immune system plays a central role. So everybody agrees, mostly they agree on this. But the question once again is this effect of an ongoing infection, or are there other autoimmune issues at play perhaps? The other point of convergence that we have managed to find despite the controversy is that most of the studies also agree that there's a little bit more work to be done in the diagnostic side of chronic Lyme disease as well. That seems to be coming out, but it's early days on that analysis, but that seems to be a little bit more of a point of convergence as well. So trends are, as you saw from one of those last graphs, that the conversation seems to be tilting and sort of favoring a little bit more the existence of chronic Lyme disease at the moment. And certainly there seem to be some favorable outlets to a particular position that your study has arrived at. So that might help you if you're wanting to publish in this area to know better which journals you might want to target.
Great. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you. So I guess some comparative insights when it comes to media and literature is, media, what we see, I was talking earlier about, often will sensationalize because, going back to, early 20th century, sensationalism sells papers and sells things. Literature presents, more, we generally see a cautious perspective, and Teo did a good description of that, really, more of an in-depth description of really what's going on. A public perception and policy impact. Media has more of an emotive style. There's much more focus on, pathos when it comes to making arguments, going back to Aristotle's idea of pathos, ethos, and logos. And literature generally is more, especially the scientific articles, are much more focused on logos or logic. That's what we generally see in our articles. There's more of a logic-driven, more, fact, more fact-driven. But what we see is literature does reflect more the conflict or the complex scientific debate. And one of the things we saw really with Teo's graphs was really we see these changes, and it's really that it shows the debate and the conversation happening within the scientific community. And we see that happening more in the scientific literature, not really happening at all, really, that we can find yet within media. The next slide, please. So when it comes to how this impacts public health, is media narratives can shape how patients behave, and it influences their treatment choices. There's been a lot of research looking at this when it comes to COVID-19 and vaccinations, particularly how people would read narratives, and from those narratives, they would make decisions. And there's been some research looking at how doctors had no idea really why my patients were making these decisions. And then when they were confronted with, well, the narratives and the media are telling them this, doctors were like, oh, I had no idea about that. I didn't know that was in the news. So a lot of times doctors had no idea what was going on in the media, and yet those media narratives were driving their patients' decisions. And so we really do see the media can drive how patients behave. It can also impact their self-advocacy. It can really impact really what we do. It has such a huge impact on our behavior. And so when we look to challenges also in scientific communication, there really is a disconnect between media and literature. And it does affect how our levels of trust is. What we find is during the COVID era, one of the things is we saw here in New Zealand, just as an example, is there is a lot of disagreement. There is some, I would say, discontent really when it came to scientific researchers who were on television talking about issues of COVID, and a lot of the public were like, why are we even listening to scientists and doctors? And so, because some media outlets were really spinning it that we can't listen to the scientific community. So we see there's that disconnect, and how we can bring that together. I think, can we? I don't know. When it comes to policy, there is a need for accurate, balanced information. So we need this. So we need really what is in the scientific journals, but we also do need to know really what media is reporting. So you've heard me say media is sensationalizing at times, and media can also spin things, but we also need to know what media is doing, because a lot of times journalists are out there talking to people on the ground as well. So we do need to listen to both, but we need to do it carefully, I would say. Next slide. So future directions. We have advances in AI and natural language processing. One of the things you'll see is, as a teacher, I have so many students now who are using ChatGPT and other kinds of generative AI. This is really going to change how we do a lot of our research. It already is changing a lot of times. I can look at Teo and see a lot of our students are using it. A lot of our staff are using it. A lot of people are using ChatGPT in businesses. What this is going to do is it is going to change how we can develop our research protocols, how we can conduct research. It's going to even change, how we do testing, I would say, in the future. And so that is going to be something that is going to change. It already is changing things. What we will see as well when it comes to media and science is we do need better bridging. We need to have better collaboration for more accurate reporting. And we've seen examples of this. I keep going back to COVID, but we did see some cases where media outlets were working with the scientific community to talk about the impact of COVID on the community. We did see some really good examples of that. So we need more of that when it comes to issues, medical and scientific issues that are affecting our community. When it comes to future research opportunities, there's a lot of them. I think some of the work that, I really appreciate the work that Teo is doing when it comes to, sentiment analysis, natural language processing and data analytics. It's something that probably about 15 years ago, I would have said, what? I have no idea what he's doing. But I've learned that over the past 15 years, I can do a little bit of what Teo does. And it's amazing. I think the more we can bring that into working with people like Leona, I mean, here we have someone who does cellular molecular biology and is like a rock star in her field, bringing in people like us, and we see that collaboration. We need more of this kind of collaboration, I think, because it helps us better understand narratives, which can then in turn help patient outcomes. Because if we can explain the narratives and how patients understand their illness, how patients understand their treatment options, how they can then be better informed. And when they go to their doctors, if doctors can also understand what patients know, they can better communicate with one another. And I think that's the important thing. I think this is you, Leona. Is
I
this
think,
me?
well, yeah, this is best for you, I
Okay.
think.
I'll do this then. Okay.
Yeah.
So in summary, media and literature are, as I've said, they will offer contrasting and differing views on tick-borne diseases. Sometimes those views might be similar, but they're very seldom are they the same. But we need to see if we can bring those together in some ways or work together on them. We need to understand the depictions because it helps us, as I said, better build strategies. As I was saying, the more our healthcare providers can understand what their patients know and what their patients think, the better they can create strategies to really help their patients. So I think the key takeaway here is balanced narratives are essential. We need to really understand what is going on and what people are thinking because that drives their behavior. If we can know what is driving people's behavior, whether it's, well, this thing was on the news, and so I need to do that. If the doctor knows, well, that's driving my patient's thinking, I can then respond to that. I can provide a healthier outcome for my patient.
Great. Well, I think Teo and Stephen, you guys are the rock stars here, and I can't wait to see in another, 3 years what content analysis and sentiment analysis is going to give us, and how we can actually push, those graphs to really acceptance of chronic Lyme. So I'm really excited for the future and working with you guys in regards to getting the narrative, a good balanced narrative on chronic Lyme disease. And so I just wanted to wrap this up with the last two slides here that please, this book is there to inspire, novices to veterans, scientists, as well as clinicians, okay, MD students, PhD students, master students, and so forth. And so we really appreciate that we have these rock stars of Stephen and Teo, coming together, a multidisciplinary kind of group to change the tides in chronic Lyme. And interesting enough, what I took out of this presentation is this. So we are trying to change the narrative by coming together and being these guest editors on special issues. And one of them is this diagnosis of treatment strategies of tick-borne diseases. So if you have papers, please do submit because we are the editors. And take notes here, Teo, too. Frontiers in Medicine is there. So we have an opportunity, even at our level, to kind of help change the narrative and acceptance of chronic Lyme by actually, providing a safe area where scientists, clinicians, alike can come together and publish their work. Of course, it's rigorous peer review, but we have the opportunity to, establish a friendly environment. So this is one of the things that was interesting for me to see from your data there, Teo, that Frontiers Medicine refutes chronic Lyme, but this is a way that we can actually influence, and we will do our best in the future to continue this with these special issues at different journals. So I want to thank you now for your time and turn this over to questions and answers. And Jillian, if you want to lead that would be great.
Thank you very much, all of you, for a fascinating presentation. One question that's been asked several times is how reliable the data from something like ChatGPT is. I'll just look at a further question where that was asked in a slightly more granular way, have you encountered any biases in AI models like BERT and ChatGPT when analyzing Lyme disease literature? And if so, how do you address these biases to ensure accurate interpretations? I don't know who feels they'd most like to answer that one. Maybe
I'm happy to jump in.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Yeah.
So ChatGPT is well known for what we call hallucinations, and that is a technical term. These models are very persuasive in the lies that they can actually produce,
Oh my
and
goodness.
they're very it's very believable because it's expressed in a very convincing and very confident terms. So yes, that is an issue. Now, they should also be caveated with the fact that these models are improving all the time. So ChatGPT, as it was in November 30th of 2022, when it was first released, to what it does today is orders of magnitude different. The hallucinations have reduced significantly. And plus, if you have a few more sort of technical capabilities where you're able to complement ChatGPT with other approaches such as retrieval augmented generation called RAG, the hallucinations can reduce significantly. Plus, there's another little tip that you can do with ChatGPT to reduce hallucinations, and that is if you feed back its output back to it, represent it, and ask it to check it, it will usually find errors and improve. Now, that is not just a crazy little tip. That is based on the architectural design of these large language models, based on the transformer, where the part of the transformer that understands the context, the attention layer, is much more capable than the decoder part, which spits out the output. And so feeding the output back to itself and say, can you please verify what you just said, will often reduce the hallucinations. Now, is there bias in models? Of course there is. There's always bias. And there is going to be particularly bias when you're applying sentiment analysis models on academic literature, because usually they're not trained on the corpus of text that involves academic literature. And so that is an issue, that is a challenge. And there isn't an easy way out of this, apart from me saying that perhaps sentiment analysis may not be the best thing to do in academic literature, but instead applying different techniques such as stance detection, which requires a deeper version of AI to understand context as a whole, and it draws in its expertise, that I think has a much better chance of succeeding well. The other thing when you're doing stance analysis, even if you choose to use sentiment analysis with large language models, is if you ask it to justify itself and reason, that tends to reduce some of the bias and at least makes it verifiable. So these are not foolproof solutions, but they certainly go some way in mitigating.
But to ask it to bring up references as well in scientific literature is, I'm sure, an easier way out, isn't it?
Yes.
To actually produce references. Sorry, I haven't got my microphone in, and I know that it makes it harder to hear me. I'll get that sorted in a moment. So another question was, can you hear me okay still?
Yes.
Because I've just plugged in my microphone. How do you best use this data to help patients? How can it be used to influence medical training?
I think, if I may, I think one of the things I said earlier is when I think the better we understand patients, the better we can help them. And so one of the things I keep going back to COVID is during COVID, I was fortunate enough to work with our hospital here in Wellington. And one of the things that the doctors kept asking is there were a few of the doctors were flabbergasted, and they're like, I don't understand why we have so many people who won't get the vaccine. I don't get it. And they were just like sitting there in a room. We're all wearing masks, of course, and really distanced. Why won't they get and I was just, do you know what I actually said, just me being just very blunt. I go, do you understand the psyche of why people don't get vaccinated? And they were just looking at me like, no, like, of course they're going to get vaccinated. Why wouldn't someone? They were just looking at me like I was an idiot. And I said, we need to understand this. And so that's when I brought in some of the research articles we had published on patient self-advocacy, on vaccine hesitancy, misinformation in vaccines. I said, here's some things. Let me give you just the Reader's Digest version of this. And they read some of that and they were just like, oh, people actually feel like this. People actually think this way. People actually listen to this kind of stuff. People actually listen to these people in Northland, part of New Zealand, who talk about, vaccines, like, Bill Gates has put things in vaccines. They listen to this kind of stuff. And I was like, yes, they do. And this is what you're dealing with. And they're like, oh, okay. So they have these fears of vaccines. Like, yes, they have fears. So you need to try to alleviate their fears. You need to understand each of your patients is an individual. And so you need to address them that way. They're not just cattle coming in where like moo, boom, 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 boom. You need to address them that way. And so I think the more we can explain how humans behave and make that real, I think that's where we can really make a difference in this way. Uh, and that's the key thing here. And our narratives really do shape how people behave, and that's the key thing. And so I think that's one of the key takeaways for me.
Maybe following on from that, what ethical considerations should researchers keep in mind when using AI for analyzing disease-related literature, particularly with sensitive topics like Lyme disease? Don't know whether that sort of resonates at all. It's a difficult one.
I would say with my work, I don't use AI very much. So I don't. I would leave it. I would defer more to Teo on this one because I don't use it very much with the kind of work that I would do. I generally survey people or look at the media itself that's been published. So, uh, Teo, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I would say we need to be very careful, is what I would say, but uh,
Yeah. So there are concerns, of course, if we are taking very confidential data, let's say patient prognosis data, and passing it to ChatGPT to try and help with further diagnoses or finding patterns that you're otherwise struggling as a physician to find. That's where issues do arise because a lot of the data, not all of it, but most of it that we pass to ChatGPT will be stored on their servers.
Mhm.
And we cannot guarantee that that data will not find its way back into the models and the models be retrained further on that data. And that, of course, raises a whole lot of issues whether or not this is ethical or even legal as well.
Mhm.
So naturally, this is a thorny issue that these big corporations that run these large language models are trying to resolve and put sort of safeguards in place whereby physicians can use them safely with assurances that it won't be used for other purposes than what actually they're supposed to be used for. So I don't have any answers. I don't think anybody has any real answers to this apart from caution at this moment in time until these issues are sorted out.
One excellent related question here is, are there any major organizations that oversee these kinds of AI tools that are not purely commercial?
No,
No.
it's a short answer. This is an unregulated area, and I think it's a discussion to be had whether or not this should be regulated or not. But no, there's no regulations around large language models. These are commercial products. Not only commercial products, some of them are open source, which means that you can actually download and run those large language models or smaller versions of the large language models on your own hardware as well. So no, there is no body that
That could
monitors.
change, couldn't it, over time in particular sectors, for example, like health?
Correct. I mean, there's certainly, I would expect legislation to be rolled out in different countries in terms of what are requirements and what is expected sort of operating behavior when it comes to patient records, whether or not they're passed to large language models that are run off premises to where you're currently situated. I'm sure each country and each organization will come up with their own policies in terms of how to handle this. And there are a lot of instances of this already.
And journals are actually implementing their own policies in regards to AI-driven data. And And one of the main concerns that they had was actually, validating the data set that's used for the model. Because how do you validate that data set? And where is that data set that's being used, and the mistakes associated with that data set? So some journals won't even accept manuscripts that are based on AI models. But there is this transparency that needs to be, I think, disclosed in if we have used, as scientists or authors of manuscripts, if we have used any kind of this AI tools, for whatever reason of the manuscripts, it definitely has to be disclosed.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very good point. One attendee here asks, does anyone in the research side working here have Lyme or know someone who does? I'm a Lyme thriver since discovery of it in 2014 when disabled by it. Now a consultant and advocate researcher and practitioner. So I think he's wondering whether that affects one's perspective as a researcher. Sorry, Leona, yes.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great point, and I think that the European Commission has actually nailed it down here, that every single kind of funding project that's coming out, that's granted from the European Commission, needs this public patient involvement. Okay, and I'm really trying to push that with everything that we're doing, is having a representative of the patient, the public, involved in everything that we do. So yes, we know, yes, we have absolutely the influence of the patient and the public, involved in what we do. So
I know you know lots of people with Lyme, Leona. You've actually made a film, haven't you, recently, or at least been involved in making a film of somebody who had Lyme for many, many years.
Yeah, the Red Ring. Yes, yes.
And again, a very related question here. And I know, Leona, that you've got lots of experience here. Can AI be used to actually harvest data from patients and their many symptoms? Perhaps decide on what tests would be appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have published even recently using machine learning and AI in analyzing patient data from the Irish data with our collaborator, Jack Lambert. And if you just, Google me, you will see our publications, and we're expanding that to, Mexican, patient data, as well as Canadian and American. And my goal is actually using a lot of these tools to really have a global analysis of chronic Lyme disease patients. And we're building that up with these patient databases. And I'm excited for the next, 12 months, how many of these informative, manuscripts we can actually get published on different sets of patient data from different countries, and seeing the common things with it.
Fantastic. I know that part of your mission is hoping to actually rouse some interest amongst those who participate in webinars like this to actually collaborate with you on that, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So John Fulbright, I see you. I can bring your you patients in Scotland. That's great. Like, really contact me, because we really we're establishing, we do have databases, patient databases, as I said, and we need to expand it so that we really,
Sorry, yes, I was just saying, so I don't forget, Leona, could you maybe pop your email into the chat?
Yes, I can.
Those who would like to contact you direct. I mean, of course, you can contact this team through AONM as well. That's info@aonm.org. Maybe Claire, you could just pop our contact details in as well. But Leona, it's lovely to have yours too. And going on to a sort of tangential topic here, Lucy asks, I can see how this technology could be abused by governments with their own agenda based on financial gain and help them to control the narrative. How could we avoid this?
Why don't we control the narrative? Why don't we establish a chronic Lyme disease large language model? I mean, this is my goal. This is one of the goals that we need to do. And Teo, we're recruiting you. And Stephen, we need to do this. We need to do this. We need to publish on this. We need to do this. We need to establish it, and keep actually addressing this illusionary truth, these myths, these misconceived narrative statements that are out there. Yeah. So there's different strategies that we have to combat this.
Yeah. No, and that frontiers in which you're going to be editing articles is just fantastic. Maybe we can have that fed into AI afterwards as well, don't you think?
You could. Yeah. Theo, are you excited with this chronic Lyme disease LLM? Because this is, I think you're a
Well, we
new,
do
yeah, go ahead.
we do a little bit of what we call fine tuning with large language models as it is already, and we've found ways to do it effectively, whereby what we do is we specialize a general purpose large language model into something that is an expert in a particular domain. And so it's certainly possible to essentially specialize an LLM into a topic, say chronic Lyme disease.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic. Well, I'm very conscious of your time. Very, very grateful that you've taken the time, all of you. Thank
Yeah.
you. And thank you so much as well, our audience, for participating, as well as everybody who listens to this afterwards, because the recording will go up onto the website in a few days, and the speakers have very kindly permitted us to put up their slides as well. So I just want to mention that in a week's time, next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, not 8 o'clock, we will have another team from of authors from Professor Gilbert's book. That is the Armin Labs team, as well as Mr. Kunal Garg, speaking about adaptive immune response investigation in Lyme borreliosis. So they will be covering both the T cell methods of testing as well as the B cell method. I did talk to Mr. Marcus Berger today, and he did emphasize we'll be covering both next time. So that will be fascinating as well. And then we do also on the 22nd of October have a talk by myself, actually, as well as Professor Brigitte Koenig, on the mitochondria and chronic health conditions. So that will be about both testing and therapy. And it'll be the first of two. And it'll be on the 22nd of October at 7 o'clock. But back to you, our wonderful team this evening. Thank you so, so much again. Very, very grateful. And hopefully, Leona, you will get further author contributions for Frontiers.
Yeah.
As well as clinics with interest in sharing your data models.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
And thank you, Taro and Stephen. You guys
Thank
are
you for
rock
having
stars.
us.
Thank you very, very much.
All right.
All the best.